Excuse me, can I help you? This is private property. You can't be here. Oh, baby. Oh,
She didn't care that my wife was 7 months pregnant. She just wanted total control, so she lunged forward and threw her off the stone steps. She thought she was just terrorizing another helpless suburban family, completely blind to the fact that she had just laid her hands on the family of an army colonel. Before watching full story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and please do not forget to subscribe to our channel so that you can get notified on daily videos. Are you out of your absolute mind? This is completely insane. A middle-aged woman's hands just slammed into my heavily pregnant wife's chest, throwing her entirely off balance. Middle of the morning, bright English sun, and she was wearing a tweed jacket that practically screamed aristocratic authority. Clara wasn't looking for a confrontation that Tuesday. She was just looking after her lavender. My wife's a primary school teacher, the kind of gentle soul who marks spelling tests with one hand and bakes shortbread with the other. That morning, she was crouched by our front stone steps in her oversized maternity smock, hair pinned back, a bit of dirt on her fingers. A perfectly ordinary Tuesday until she spotted the notice. A neon yellow slip of paper taped directly to our wooden porch post, bold letters shouting violation, unapproved garden furniture, unauthorized landscaping, fines escalating in 48 hours. Clara read it twice, then immediately pulled out her phone. "We are not dealing with this blind," she muttered under her breath. That's her teacher instinct kicking in. Document the problem first, argue the details later. 25 years married to an army officer taught her the exact same operational rule. Hard evidence keeps bullies honest. That is precisely when the estate dictator arrived. Two figures in formal attire strutted across our pristine lawn like they were an elite task force clearing a hostile perimeter. The first, Margaret Sterling, was built like a country manor headmistress, clutching a silver clipboard to her chest like a shield of absolute law. The second, her deputy Nigel, had a tailored suit but absolutely zero spine, his eyes darting around nervously as if even the air on our property belonged to them. "Madam, cease your recording of official management company enforcement actions immediately," Margaret barked. Her voice tried desperately for aristocratic command but landed somewhere between a bitter traffic warden and a historical reenactor. Clara didn't even flinch. She has commanded classrooms of 30 unruly 7-year-olds with far more terrifying authority than this. She kept the phone perfectly steady, her voice calm and measured. "This is my private property. You are being recorded." That right there should have been the end of it. But Margaret's jaw tightened, her face twisting into a mask of pure, vindictive rage. She took 2 aggressive steps forward up our stone walkway and lunged. The force of her push sent Clara reeling backward off the 2-foot stone ledge. The sound of her phone shattering against the gravel path cracked through the quiet close like a pistol shot. The screen fractured into a web of broken glass but stayed alive, the lens still catching the chaotic sky and the tops of the houses. Clara stumbled, losing her footing entirely, her arms flailing wildly as she tried to twist her body in midair to protect her 7-month pregnant belly. She collapsed heavily onto the grass with a sharp, breathless cry of pure terror. The neighborhood completely froze. Curtains twitched in the windows opposite. Mrs. Higgins' miniature schnauzer went completely limp on its lead. Somewhere down the street, a car door slammed and the echo died instantly. Everyone heard it. Everyone knew a line had just been crossed that could never be uncrossed. And something deep inside my chest snapped. 25 years of service, multiple operational deployments to hostile territories, and I had never allowed anyone to hurt my family like that. The fury that tore through my veins was ice-cold, blinding, but completely steady. The kind of tactical rage that doesn't make you shake. It makes you lethal. The heavy front door swung open behind them. That single, solid thud of timber was enough to make both of them spin around. I wasn't wearing my formal uniform with the colonel's insignia anymore. Just a faded regimental polo, cargo trousers, and bare feet on the stone threshold. But a military posture is its own kind of weapon. Weight balanced perfectly on the balls of my feet, shoulders squared, breathing deeply controlled. The very air on the porch seemed to drop 10 degrees. The 2 enforcement officers stiffened instantly, their arrogant swagger evaporating faster than morning mist on the Thames. "I am a retired British Army colonel," I said evenly. Not shouting, not raising my voice, just stating an operational fact. "You just assaulted my pregnant wife on my property. Now listen here, we are within our legal rights," Margaret sneered, but I saw it clearly. The sudden, terrified flicker of doubt behind her eyes. Nigel's hands began to visibly tremble. Then my voice shifted into a tone I hadn't used since commanding men under live fire. Calm, freezing, and absolute. "Stand down. Keep your hands where I can see them. Final warning." The command hung in the humid Surrey air like a drawn blade. But instead of retreating, Margaret's face flushed a deep crimson and she reached out to grab Clara's shattered phone from the gravel to destroy the evidence. I intercepted her movement before she could even take a full step. Years of close-quarters training turned the defense completely automatic. I caught her wrist with an iron grip, pivoting slightly to redirect her momentum away from my wife. The sudden restriction made her gasp, her silver clipboard slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the stones. Nigel, seeing his leader suddenly neutralized, made the incredibly foolish decision to intervene, lunging forward with his arms swinging wildly like an amateur boxer. I sidestepped his clumsy rush with ease. Gravity and his own panicked momentum did the rest of the work. Nigel tripped over the low stone border of our flower bed, tumbling face-first into our automated pop-up sprinkler system with a dull, heavy thud. The plastic nozzle smacked his chin sideways, and his glasses flew into the dirt. His low groan turned to instant, garbled nonsense as the morning watering cycle suddenly clicked on, spraying high-pressure water directly into his open mouth. Both of them were completely neutralized in less than 30 seconds. Clara's phone lay in the dirt. The lens was badly cracked, but the recording light was still pulsing red. It had caught every single second of the interaction. The argument, the violent push, the terrifying fall, and the immediate aftermath. Every single frame was recorded, perfect digital proof against these suburban tyrants. I helped Clara up with infinite care, her hands still trembling against her belly as she checked for any sign of pain. She winced as she leaned on me, her voice shaking but her resolve unbroken. "It's still rolling," she whispered, leaning into my shoulder. My wife was stronger than half the recruits I had ever trained. The entire estate of Orchard Green was wide awake now. Mrs. Higgins was standing by her hedge, her mobile phone raised high, filming the entire scene as if her life depended on it. Mr. Patel stood at the edge of his driveway, arms crossed, staring in utter disbelief at the estate's feared chairperson now cowering on our grass. The scene had transformed completely from a petty backyard squabble into a live, undeniable crime scene. Margaret groaned loudly, clutching her bruised wrist, her voice cracking into a high, panicked register. "You put your hands on me. That's assault." The irony of her words screamed louder than the water rushing from the sprinkler head. Nigel was still face down in the lavender, coughing up water and muttering incoherent threats about lawsuits, looking less like a powerful estate executive and more like a soaked toddler throwing a tantrum in a puddle. I didn't gloat, and I didn't say another word to either of them. I simply pulled out my own phone and dialed the police. "This is Colonel Jack Vance at number 4 Orchard Green Close. I require immediate police attendance and an ambulance. A pregnant woman has been assaulted on private property by representatives of the management company. Send units immediately." As I ended the call, something caught my eye on the grass. Margaret's silver clipboard had burst open when it hit the stones, scattering sheets of paper across the lawn. One specific page caught the morning light, a highly organized spreadsheet containing names, door numbers, financial standing, and a final column explicitly labeled leverage. Clara reached down, her phone camera focusing sharply on the document. We both realized in that exact moment that this wasn't a standard neighborhood dispute. This was an organized campaign of intimidation. By the time the blue and red lights of the Surrey police cruisers began slicing through the morning air, Orchard Green Close had completely shed its quiet, suburban skin. It didn't look like a premium residential development anymore. It looked like a secured crime scene. Margaret Sterling was sitting on our stone wall, her face completely pale, clutching her wrist while her chest heaved beneath her mud-stained tweed jacket. Nigel was slumped against our brick pillar, his expensive suit soaked through, coughing up remnants of the sprinkler water while muttering incoherent threats about corporate lawyers and human rights violations. The high-pressure water arcs kept dancing in the background, catch-and-release glints of the British sun framing a scene of absolute chaos. Clara, holding a warm mug of tea Mr. Patel had rushed over, sat on our porch swing, her face pale but her hand perfectly steady as she kept her damaged phone aimed at the pair. Neighbors had fully broken cover now. They weren't just peeking behind curtains anymore. 20 people were lining the pavement, several with their own phones raised, recording the dynamic shift in power. Nobody offered Margaret a tissue. Nobody stepped forward to help Nigel squeeze the water out of his bespoke trousers. The entire estate had spent 3 years cowering under their petty tyranny, and watching their administrative empire collapse into our flower beds was a spectator sport no one wanted to miss. Then came the voice that immediately anchored the room. "Jack, my God, what on earth has happened here?" Arthur Pendleton, a retired chief inspector from the Metropolitan Police who lived just 3 doors down, marched across our lawn. Arthur didn't do typical retirement. He still wore ironed brogues and possessed a gaze that could strip paint off a suspect room wall. He took one comprehensive look at the state of Nigel, the absolute fury radiating from my posture, and the distinctive red marks on Clara's arms where she had tried to catch her fall. These absolute amateurs leave a wider trail of destruction than a joyrider in a stolen lorry, Arthur muttered, his voice carrying the heavy weight of 3 decades on the force. I didn't say a word. I simply pointed to the scattered sheets of paper littering the gravel walkway where Margaret's silver clipboard had burst open. The top page was still fully visible, the morning breeze fluttering the edges of a highly confidential spreadsheet. Arthur knelt down, adjusting his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the neatly typed rows. His jaw tightened instantly, a low, sharp whistle escaping his teeth. "Jack, you haven't just caught a rogue property manager," he whispered, looking up with an expression that went cold in an instant. "This is a targeted extortion index. You're holding a smoking gun that goes straight to the Crown Court." The official response was swift and heavy. 2 police vehicles and a rapid response paramedic unit blocked the entrance to the close, their sirens dying down to a low, mechanical hum. Paramedics immediately swarmed Clara, checking her blood pressure and monitoring the baby's heart rate while an officer stood guard beside them, blocking Margaret from uttering another intimidating word. A young, sharp-eyed police sergeant named Davies stepped onto our property, taking in the entire tactical layout of the afternoon. He looked at Nigel's broken glasses, Margaret's bruised pride, and then at me. I introduced myself with my full rank, presenting my military identification alongside our home deed. The shift in the officer's demeanor was instantaneous. Respect replaced standard suspicion. Clara handed over her shattered phone, the video file already compressed and securely backed up to our cloud drive. Sergeant Davies watched the footage twice, his mouth thinning into a hard, grim line as the digital audio clearly replayed the unmistakable thud of Margaret's hands striking Clara's chest, followed by her terrifying stumble off the stone steps. The evidence was absolute, objective, and utterly devastating. Nigel tried to launch into a practiced, defensive speech about estate compliance bylaws and unauthorized structural changes to the close, but Sergeant Davies held up a single, authoritative hand that cut him off mid-sentence. "Save it for the station, sir," the sergeant said flatly. "We have clear video evidence of physical assault on a vulnerable individual, trespass, and criminal damage to property. The fake badges and management company credentials clipped to your pockets aren't going to save you from an official caution today." The officers moved in, systematically collecting the scattered documentation from the lawn, ensuring every single page of Margaret's secret ledger was secured in evidence bags. Arthur Pendleton leaned in close to me, his voice a low whisper as the police began escorting a protesting Margaret toward the rear of a secure transport van. "Orchard Green Management Limited isn't just a residence committee, Jack," Arthur warned, his eyes locked on the vehicle. "I've been digging into their corporate filings since they tried to fine me for my greenhouse last winter. They're a private holding firm registered in Delaware, using local operators to systematically devalue properties through targeted fines, forcing residents into equity sell-offs. Margaret isn't just an overzealous neighbor, she's an enforcement agent for a corporate raider. The weight of that revelation settled deep in my stomach as the police vehicles finally pulled away from the close, their engines fading into the distance. Clara was cleared by the paramedics, shaken, bruised, but the baby's heartbeat was strong and steady, a relief that allowed the ice in my veins to settle into a focused operational plan. The neighborhood didn't go back inside. The air felt thick, charged with an uneasy energy that reminded me of a forward operating base right before an expected mortar barrage. We weren't just dealing with an aggressive neighbor who hated lavender, we were dealing with an economic assault on our entire community. That very evening, as the shadows of the oak trees lengthened across the close, our front doorbell rang. Clara opened it to find Eleanor Vance, an elderly widow who lived at number 12, clutching a heavy manila folder against her cardigan as if it were a shield against an enemy patrol. Her hands were visibly trembling, her eyes darting nervously down the street toward Margaret's darkened, empty driveway before she slipped inside our hallway. "I cannot carry this secret around another day," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking as we guided her into our living room. She sat at our wooden table, staring at her own reflection in the polished surface. "I've been helping her for 18 months, she confessed, tears welling in her eyes. "Margaret made me feel like I was protecting the heritage of the estate. She told me I was her eyes and ears on the ground. She had me logging the exact times Mr. Patel came home from his hospital shifts, tracking which neighbors had overnight visitors, and photographing anyone who left their wheelie bins out past noon on collection day. I honestly thought it was just standard, harmless community pride until I saw her push Clara today. That was evil." She slid the manila folder across the table toward me. Inside were dozens of printed emails, bank statements, and copies of a handwritten journal belonging to Margaret. It was a complete operational overview of the close. Clara and I spread the documents across the table like topographical maps of a hostile territory. Every single page was a calculated exercise in human exploitation. Columns were meticulously drawn by hand, labeled with resident names, observed domestic vulnerabilities, arbitrary fine balances, and the chilling final header, leverage points. Beside Mr. Patel's name, Margaret had written, "Junior doctor, triple shifts, sleep deprived. Increase lawn weeds fines during exam weeks to maximize psychological pressure." Beside Eleanor's own name, the entry read, "High compliance potential, lonely, easily manipulated via inclusion." And then the row that hit me like a physical round to the chest. "Mitchell, number 8, outstanding structural fence fee totaling £4,000. Notice of equity lien prepared. High risk of foreclosure." I looked up at Clara, her bruised arms catching the dim light of our table lamp. "This isn't a neighborhood association," I said, the realization settling with cold certainty. "This is a localized racketeering ring running a psychological warfare campaign against its own residents." Arthur Pendleton arrived a few minutes later, joining us around the spread of incriminating data. He picked up a bank statement, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed a series of monthly outgoing transfers. "This confirms my theory," Arthur said, tapping the paper with his pen. "Look at these figures. Margaret has been systematically siphoning off over £25,000 of communal maintenance fees into a private account registered to an entity called Sovereign Assets Group. This isn't just petty theft, it's organized corporate fraud. She's intentionally starved the estate's infrastructure fund to justify raising emergency levies on the residents, forcing the vulnerable ones into debt they can't clear." I clenched my fists, the familiar, cold tactical focus taking over my mind. "And she deployed her hired thugs to assault my wife when we refused to break," I muttered. Clara placed her hand over mine, her grip remarkably firm for someone who had been thrown off a porch just hours prior. "We have the intelligence now, Jack. Real, actionable intelligence. We don't just defend our home anymore, we dismantle her entire network." But Arthur wasn't looking at the bank statements anymore. He had turned to the very last page of Margaret's handwritten journal. The ink on this page was different, fresher, pressed harder into the paper with an aggressive slant. At the very bottom of the ledger, double underlined in red ink, were 3 words that changed the entire nature of the threat. Phase 2 initiated. If legal compliance fails, deploy maximum distress. Jail asset cleared for deployment. Arthur looked across the table at me, his seasoned detective's expression completely devoid of comfort. She knew this day would come, Jack. She has a backup plan already operational on this estate, and whoever GL is, they aren't bound by the Residents Association bylaws. The room went dead silent, the only sound being the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Clara stared at the words maximum distress as if they were an active coordinates list for a strike. The battle for Orchard Green Close hadn't ended with the arrival of the police van. It had simply escalated to the next operational phase. The following morning, the Guildford Magistrates' Court felt like a Victorian theatre designed for high-stakes human tragedy. The air smelled of industrial floor polish and institutional anxiety. The public gallery was packed tight with our neighbors, shoulder to shoulder in their winter coats, their low whispers echoing off the high stone walls. I wore my finest civilian tailoring, the charcoal wool suit I usually reserved for regimental dinners, while Clara stood beside me in a sharp tailored dress that highlighted her undeniable resilience. Arthur Pendleton sat directly behind us, a leather briefcase resting flat on his knees like an arsenal of legal artillery. Margaret Sterling sat at the defense table, completely transformed from her country house demeanor. She was flanked by a high-priced barrister from a London firm whose silver cufflinks caught the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. She refused to look in our direction, keeping her eyes locked onto a small leather notebook, her fingers drumming a frantic, silent rhythm against the wood. And then, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and Carl Mitchell walked in. For a brief, hopeful second, the neighbors in the gallery shifted to make space for him, assuming he was joining our ranks. Instead, Carl kept his head bowed, his face flushed with a deep, burning shame as he walked straight past our bench and took a seat directly behind Margaret's legal team. A low, collective murmur of disbelief rippled through the gallery, the distinct, heavy sound of community trust fracturing in real time. When Carl was called to the witness stand to testify regarding the history of estate disputes, his voice was so weak the court clerk had to adjust the microphone twice. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Clara. "Your Honor," Carl began, his hands trembling violently as he clutched the edge of the wooden box. "Colonel Jack Vance has spent the last month orchestrating an aggressive campaign to subvert the legally binding guidelines of our estate. He told me explicitly that if I didn't support his resistance against the management company, he would use his military background to ensure my family faced severe consequences. He is a trained killer, and we are terrified of what he might do." A sharp, collective gasp exploded from the gallery. Clara's fingers dug into my palm with enough force to turn her knuckles white. Carl continued, the words rushing out of him in a desperate torrent, as if he needed to finish the script before he choked on his own deceit. "My children play in that close every day. When a former Army colonel tells you what he is capable of during a tactical deployment, you take the threat seriously. I couldn't risk my family's physical safety over a simple £4,000 estate dispute. Mrs. Sterling kindly offered to completely restructure my family's outstanding debt if I agreed to come forward and testify truthfully about the violent environment the Vances are creating in our neighborhood." He slumped back into the witness chair, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his forehead, looking like a man who had just traded his entire soul for a financial lifeline. The magistrate frowned, her pen hovering over her notepad as she stared down at me with newfound suspicion. To anyone without the full context, Carl looked like a terrified, broken father seeking protection from a rogue military officer. Margaret's barrister smiled smoothly, turning toward the magistrate with an air of absolute victory. But Arthur Pendleton didn't blink. He calmly stood up, walked to the prosecution table, and requested permission to introduce supplementary digital evidence that had been secured and verified by Surrey police just 6 hours prior. The magistrate gave a brief, decisive nod. Arthur queued up a video file on the court's digital display network. It wasn't the footage from the assault. It was a secret recording from 3 nights before, captured by Mr. Patel's home security system during an emergency close meeting in our driveway. The audio crackled to life, filling the high-ceilinged room with Carl Mitchell's own unmistakable voice. "Jack Vance is the most honorable man on this estate. He's a leader, and he's the only one with the courage to stand up to Margaret's illegal extortion. I am with him 100%. The transformation in the courtroom was instantaneous and total. Carl's face completely lost its color, his jaw dropping as his own words echoed back to condemn him from the walls of the court. The gallery erupted into a wall of angry whispers and pointed fingers. Arthur didn't stop there. With a practiced, legal precision, he displayed the poster-sized digital copies of Margaret's secret ledger pages on the screens. The entry for Carl Mitchell was highlighted in stark, undeniable high definition. Mitchell, number 8. £4,000 structural debt. High leverage opportunity. Total compliance expected upon threat of immediate equity liquidation. The magistrate peered over her reading glasses, her eyes turning into shards of pure ice as she fixed her gaze on the witness stand. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice dropping into a register that made the entire room freeze. "Your testimony today under sacred oath directly contradicts both your recorded statements and the objective corporate evidence retrieved from the defendant's premises. I will remind you that perjury carries an immediate custodial sentence. Are you lying to this court now, or were you lying then?" Carl completely broke. The thin veneer of his manufactured courage dissolved into a pathetic display of raw, sobbing desperation. Tears streamed down his face as his shoulders shook uncontrollably. "I'm sorry," he wailed, his voice cracking through the microphone. "I had no choice. My business failed last quarter, and we were 3 weeks away from a repossession notice. Margaret promised me she would completely erase the £4,000 debt and clear our compliance record if I helped her paint the Colonel as a violent madman. She said the London lawyers would handle everything and I'd be safe." The atmosphere in the room shifted like a tectonic plate. The anger in the gallery redirected away from me and focused squarely on Margaret Sterling with a terrifying intensity. Margaret's smooth barrister began frantically shuffling his papers, his face turning a deep shade of embarrassed pink, while Margaret herself lost her icy composure for the first time since the morning of the assault. Her lips pulled back into a venomous, snarling line as she stared down at the weeping man who had just destroyed her defense. "This court takes the subversion of justice and witness intimidation with the utmost gravity," the magistrate announced, her gavel coming down with a sound like a rifle crack echoing through the chamber. "Given the undeniable evidence of extreme financial coercion, this court will defer immediate sentencing for Mr. Mitchell pending his absolute and total cooperation with the wider criminal investigation into Sovereign Assets Group. As for Mrs. Sterling, your bail is officially revoked. You will be remanded in custody until the formal trial for aggravated assault, corporate fraud, and witness tampering commences." 2 security guards stepped forward, their heavy boots echoing on the hardwood as they took positions on either side of Margaret. As they pulled her up from her seat, she leaned across the wooden divider, her eyes locked onto Carl Mitchell's trembling frame, and hissed a sentence that made the color drain completely from his face. Arthur caught the movement, his hand instantly dropping onto my shoulder as he muttered a low warning. "Jack, look at his face. That wasn't a threat about money. She still holds a piece of leverage over that man that we haven't found yet. This operational theater is still live." The next morning, the air inside our kitchen felt heavier than the winter fog rolling off the North Downs. Clara's arms were still heavily bandaged where the gravel had torn her skin, but she was moving around the counter with that stubborn, unyielding grace that made her the anchor of our family. I sat at the table, a cold cup of black coffee completely forgotten beside a notebook where I had been systematically cross-referencing every corporate entity linked to Sovereign Assets Group. The morning sun was trying to break through our blinds, casting long, sharp shadows across the paperwork like the iron bars of a holding cell. It matched the strategic landscape perfectly. We had won a tactical victory in the courtroom, but the wider perimeter was still entirely insecure. At exactly 9:45, my encrypted phone buzzed on the table. It was an unlisted number, and the message consisted of a single cold line of text. "Your wife teaches at Sunset Lane Primary, doesn't she? Public drop-off zones are incredibly difficult to secure. A friend." My blood ran cold, turning to absolute ice in a fraction of a second. Clara read the message over my shoulder, her breath catching in her throat as her hand instinctively dropped back onto her stomach. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling but her eyes flashing with an instant, maternal fury. "They're targeting my school. they're targeting my children. Within seconds, her teacher instincts overrode her fear. She was already taking screenshots, exporting the metadata, and saving the files directly to our secure external drive. It was her tactical reflex: document the threat immediately, process the terror later. But her fingers were shaking against the glass screen. I had seen that exact expression once before, in a dusty compound outside Lashkar, when local civilians realized their village had just been targeted by an insurgent cell. Arthur Pendleton walked through our back door less than 10 minutes later, his face set in a hard, professional mask. He read the text message once and immediately unclipped his old police radio housing from his belt. This has crossed the line from a civil estate dispute into a major indictable offense, Arthur said, his voice dropping into an operational cadence. We are dealing with targeted intimidation of a witness and a direct threat to a public educational facility. This triggers the special branch. Eleanor Vance arrived shortly after, her face red from a frantic walk across the close, carrying yet another folder of Margaret's archived files. She spread a fresh set of handwritten notes across our kitchen table, her voice shaking with terror. "I found these at the bottom of the management lockbox," she gasped. These are her specific plans for when the residents started fighting back. Look at the dates. My eyes locked onto a page written in Margaret's aggressive, heavy handwriting. One line practically screamed off the paper: Phase 3, institutional pressure. If the close remains non-compliant, disrupt primary vulnerabilities. Maximum distress protocol. Clara covered her mouth, her voice a low, horrified whisper. She's going after the children to force us to drop the criminal charges. I stared at the page, my heart hammering a steady, lethal rhythm against my ribs. Margaret Sterling had deployed hired enforcers to assault my pregnant wife. She had coerced a desperate father into committing perjury, and now she was coordinating an active threat against an entire primary school full of children. Arthur was already on his mobile, speaking to his former contacts within the Surrey Counterterrorism and Intelligence Unit, his voice clipped, efficient, and unyielding. I have a live threat profile against Sunset Lane Primary School. Suburban asset manipulation linked to an offshore fraud ring. I need digital forensics on an unlisted numbers pool immediately. When he hung up, he looked across the table at me with an expression I had seen on senior commanders right before a high-casualty deployment. They aren't bluffing, Jack. People who run operations like Sovereign Assets Group don't make empty threats to scare you off. They test your structural boundaries until you hit them back with enough force to break them completely. Clara leaned against the kitchen counter, her phone now buzzing continuously with urgent updates from the school governors. Parents were already picking up on rumors of an estate security breach, and panic was starting to filter through the community like wildfire. She looked at me, her eyes wild with a mixture of terror and resolve. If anything happens to those children because of our court case, Jack, I will never forgive myself. I stepped forward, catching her shoulders with a firm, unyielding grip. Nothing is going to happen to those children, Clara. Not while I am still drawing breath. But even as I said the words, a cold drop of doubt echoed in my mind. Margaret's secret ledger wasn't just a list of names. It was an extensive intelligence network. She knew the school's layout, she knew the gate schedules, and if Phase 3 was already live, then every single dismissal bell was a countdown to a potential catastrophe. We met at a secluded little pub off the A3, the kind of gravel driveway establishment where the low timber beams smell permanently of stale ale and wood smoke. It was neutral ground, isolated enough to ensure no one from the Orchard Green estate would stumble upon us. I spotted him immediately sitting in the darkest corner booth. He had a heavily weathered face, a faded regimental tattoo peeking from beneath the rolled sleeve of his canvas jacket, and a distinct stiffness in his right leg that screamed a past combat injury. He didn't offer a dramatic greeting as I sat down, just a slow, solemn nod of recognition between two men who had worn the same camouflage. "Colonel Jack Vance," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that felt like it had been dragged through miles of operational trenches. "My name is George Lamb. I am Margaret Sterling's ex-husband." That name hit my chest with the precise impact of a tactical round. The initials GL from the ledger. The backup plan. "You've been monitoring her," I stated flatly. shifting my weight to scan the room. George took a slow sip of his bitter, his eyes tracking the pub door before returning to mine. 15 years of marriage to that woman teaches you to map her patterns before they destroy you, he said, sliding a thick manila folder across the sticky wooden table. After what she pulled on your lawn with Clara, I couldn't just sit in the shadows and watch another family get dismantled. I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the contents under the dim amber light of the pub. It was an absolute goldmine of financial ruin, offshore banking records, encrypted messaging logs, and corporate registration documents spanning back a decade. She told the entire estate committee that I passed away in a training accident in Cyprus, George muttered with a grim, humorless smirk. It was a much cleaner narrative for her than admitting she systematically drained my military pension and drove me out of my own home through legal trickery. But what she didn't realize is that I kept every single receipt. I flipped through the pages, my tactical training immediately linking the data points. There were direct, monthly transfers from the Orchard Green communal maintenance accounts into unlisted shell companies with names like Sovereign Compliance Limited and Vanguard Enforcement Assets. Thousands of pounds funneled directly into her private, localized empire of intimidation. But the true detonation point wasn't the paper. It was an old, scratched smartphone George quietly placed on the table between us. He pressed play on an audio file. Margaret's unmistakable, sharp voice filled the quiet booth, slurred slightly by wine but carrying an unimaginable malice. George, you pathetic bastard, I will completely erase anyone who dares to remind me of your failures, the recording hissed. These arrogant military types think they are entirely above the law just because they have a chest full of ribbons. I hired those compliance boys specifically to teach that colonel's wife a lesson she won't forget. She brought this entirely on herself the moment she aimed her camera at my authority. My grip tightened on the edge of the wooden table until my knuckles went completely white, the image of Clara falling off our stone steps flashing violently in my mind. She calls my burner phone every month when she's had too much to drink, George explained, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. Always the same threats, always the same obsession with absolute control. 2 years ago, I started hitting record. I knew with absolute certainty that her ego would eventually drive her to cross a line she couldn't retreat from. He pressed play on a second file. Margaret's voice returned, dropping into a chilling, calculated whisper. Carl Mitchell is weak. Financial debt makes people remarkably cooperative. Phase 2 worked perfectly to isolate him. Phase 3 will break the rest of the close. Maximum institutional distress. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the pieces of the operational puzzle locked into place. This wasn't an overzealous neighborhood watch leader. This was a deeply unstable woman orchestrating a criminal racket like an insurgent cell commander. George leaned over the table, his eyes locking onto mine with an unyielding intensity. You think she's dangerous because she's behind bars right now, Jack? You haven't seen her when her perimeter is fully breached. She doesn't just want to manage a housing development. She wants to completely crush anyone she cannot force to bend to her will. He slid a compact USB drive across the table, resting it directly on top of the files. Everything is on there. The complete digital trail, verified emails, offshore account routing numbers, and every single voice recording. Enough to ensure the Crown Prosecution Service buries her for a very long time. I pocketed the drive, my mind already calculating our next movement. Why step forward now, George? Why give me the weapon to finish her? He stared out the stained glass window at the rain beginning to pelt the car park. Because Phase 3 isn't a theoretical threat, Jack. She sent me an encrypted message from her holding cell coordinates this morning through an intermediary. Maximum distress is scheduled for tomorrow at the school gates. If you don't neutralize her network now, the next time you see her name, it won't be in a local newspaper. It will be on a national tragedy broadcast. The Orchard Green Community Center had never seen an assembly like this in its entire history. The metal folding chairs were packed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked coats and absolute panic. There were no polite discussions about lawn maintenance or parking permits tonight. This was a community preparing for a siege. Clara and I arrived 30 minutes early, a military habit to secure the physical ground before a major engagement. Arthur Pendleton stood by a digital projector we had mounted to the timber rafters, his face set like a seasoned detective preparing a raid brief, while Eleanor Potts sat in the front row, holding her breath. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence the exact moment I stepped up to the small wooden podium at the front of the hall. "Neighbors," I began, my voice carrying that low, resonant baritone that had once commanded battalions across active borders. "This campaign has never been about the height of a fence or the color of our lavender. This is about a criminal enterprise that has systematically transformed our neighborhood into a private extortion ring. And tonight, you are going to see the exact face of the monster you've been funding." Clara struck the keyboard, cued the projector, and the footage of her assault exploded onto the wide screen behind me. A collective gasp tore through the room as the high-definition lens replayed the exact moment Margaret Sterling's hands slammed violently into Clara's pregnant chest. The audio was horrifyingly clear, the sharp, breathless cry of terror from my wife, the sickening thud of her body hitting the grass, and the arrogant sneer on Margaret's face as she stood over her. A father in the second row slammed his fist against his knee, swearing under his breath, while several mothers covered their mouths in complete disbelief. Before the crowd could even process the rage, Arthur switched the display to the blown-up images of Margaret's secret ledger. Names, account balances, and domestic vulnerabilities were displayed for the entire room to read. Mr. Patel stood up instantly, his face flushed with anger as he pointed at the screen. "She was tracking my hospital shift logs to find me while I was performing emergency surgeries," he shouted, his voice cracking with indignation. The room erupted into a wall of shouting, neighbors turning to one another as they realized every single weakness they had ever suffered had been weaponized against them to fund Margaret's corporate fraud. Arthur took the microphone, his calm, methodical police training instantly restoring structural order to the room. "Over the last 48 hours, with the assistance of Surrey Police, we have verified that Margaret Sterling has illegally diverted over £35,000 of your resident association fees into an offshore corporate entity known as Sovereign Assets Group," he announced, his voice slicing through the remnants of the chatter. This wasn't estate management. It was an organized, multi-layered racketeering operation. George Lamb then stepped forward from the shadows of the rear exit, pressing play on the USB master file. Margaret's drunken, venomous audio recording poured through the community center speakers, her slurred words detailing exactly how she had hired private compliance thugs to assault a pregnant woman just to protect her pride. The revelation was absolute. The illusion of her authority was completely shattered, reduced to the pathetic, vindictive ramblings of a fraudster. Mrs. Patterson, the long-standing vice-chairperson of the committee, stood up with a trembling hand but a fierce determination in her eyes, banging a metal gavel against the table. "Order. Under Section 12 of our communal bylaws, I officially call for an immediate vote of no confidence and the permanent removal of Margaret Sterling from this board." A forest of hands shot into the air instantly, unanimous, ferocious, and total. The gavel slammed down with absolute finality. "Colonel Jack Vance is hereby appointed interim chairperson of the Orchard Green Estate, with Arthur Pendleton taking over immediate operational security," Mrs. Patterson announced over the roar of approval. The neighbors stood up, clapping, shouting across the room as if a decades-long occupation had finally been lifted from their doorsteps. But as the applause echoed off the rafters, my phone buzzed violently inside my pocket. I pulled it out, my eyes locking onto a new message from an unlisted number pool. The text message was just one line, cold, clinical, and precise. "The interim chairperson cannot protect the perimeter of Sunset Lane Primary School. Dismissal is at 15:15 tomorrow. Enjoy the countdown, friend." The ice returned to my veins with a freezing intensity. I looked across the chaotic, celebrating room at Clara, who was watching me with an expression of sudden, sharp dread. Margaret Sterling was locked inside a secure holding cell, her corporate accounts were frozen, and her committee was destroyed, but Phase 3 was a fully automated mechanism, and the timer had just started ticking. The Surrey dawn broke gray and unforgiving, the mist hanging low over the hedgerows of Sunset Lane like tactical smoke. I stood at the perimeter fence of the primary school, my eyes scanning every single vehicle that entered the drop-off zone with the practiced precision of an officer checking a hostile checkpoint. Arthur Pendleton sat in his unmarked vehicle 50 yards down the road, his police band radio crackling quietly as his team monitored the digital signature of the anonymous burner phones. Special Branch had been briefed, patrols had been doubled, but in the real world, no perimeter is ever 100% secure against a desperate enemy. Clara stood at the main doors of the school, her yellow high-visibility jacket marking her position as she safely guided her young students inside the building. She looked exhausted, the strain of the ongoing psychological warfare taking a visible toll on her posture, but her chin remained set with that unyielding resilience that made her my equal in every single conflict we had ever faced. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the atmosphere around the school gates had completely shifted. Word of the security alert had systematically filtered through the parental network, and the quiet lane was suddenly choked with an unprecedented column of vehicles. Minivans and estate cars lined the curbs 3 hours before the final bell, parents standing in small, anxious clusters on the pavement, their eyes darting toward every unfamiliar face. The collective anxiety of the neighborhood was palpable, a heavy, suffocating pressure that seemed to silence the normal chatter of the afternoon. At exactly 3 o'clock, Arthur's voice broke through my earpiece, sharp, urgent, and completely devoid of its usual calm. "Jack, we've got a dynamic target movement. A black transport van just bypassed our secondary checkpoint at the top of the lane. It's registered to an unlisted asset holding company linked directly to Sovereign Assets Group. It's moving toward the main gate right now." My heart rate didn't elevate. It settled into that lethal, steady rhythm that governs live combat operations. I stepped off the pavement, positioning myself directly in the center of the narrow lane, my boots anchored firmly into the tarmac as the heavy black van rounded the corner, its speed completely inappropriate for a school zone. Parents began to scream, scrambling toward the security gates, pulling their children back behind the iron bars as the vehicle accelerated. I didn't flinch, I didn't move an inch. I reached into my jacket, my hand locking onto the heavy maglite torch I carried as a defensive implement, my eyes locked onto the tinted windshield of the oncoming threat. 30 yards. 20 yards. The driver saw my posture, unyielding, completely stationary, the unmistakable stance of an infantry commander who would sooner let a vehicle run him down than yield an inch of his defensive perimeter. At the very last second, the driver's courage shattered against my resolve. The brakes shrieked violently, the heavy van skidding sideways across the wet tarmac, stopping a mere 2 feet from where I stood. The side door of the transport van flew open with a mechanical crash, and 2 men in tactical security uniforms lunged out, carrying heavy legal notice boards and cameras, clearly deploying to stage a massive, high-distress enforcement disruption to trigger an immediate evacuation panic. But before their boots could even settle on the asphalt, Arthur's unmarked vehicle roared up from behind, trapping their escape route, while 2 Surrey police interceptor units swarmed the perimeter with their sirens wailing. Officers poured from the cruisers, their batons drawn, tackling the enforcers to the ground before they could even utter a single syllable of intimidation. The driver was hauled out of the front seat, slammed against the hood of the van, and securely cuffed within seconds. I walked past the chaotic scuffle entirely, stepping up to the side of the open van door, my eyes locking onto a laptop screen mounted to the dashboard. It was a live tracking link, displaying an encrypted text command sent from a proxy server just 5 minutes prior. "Deploy distress protocol now." The source of the signal was a secure terminal located inside the administrative wing of the Guilford holding facility. Margaret had triggered the strike from her cell, but her private network had just run headfirst into a military-grade counter-ambush. 3 months later, the silence that settled over Orchard Green Close was finally an honest one. The silver Range Rover was gone, repossessed by the liquidators alongside the rest of Margaret Sterling's fraudulent assets. The pristine, silver, "For Sale" sign outside her former residence had been replaced by a bright, bold, "Sold" notice, the property acquired by a young family from London who had no idea their new home had once been the command center of a suburban mafia. The estate had transformed completely, the high-contrast yellow violation notices were a thing of the past, replaced by community notice boards advertising weekend barbecues and shared gardening initiatives. Carl Mitchell had successfully restructured his family debt through a community-backed credit union we had established, his face finally losing that haunted look of a man living under a permanent blackmail threat. He spent his weekends helping Mr. Patel build a new, communal greenhouse at the center of the estate turf, seeking his own quiet redemption through honest labor. Clara sat on our front porch swing, the warm afternoon sun bathing her face as she gently rocked our newborn son, Leo, who was sleeping peacefully wrapped in a soft wool blanket. Her arms had fully healed, the physical remnants of that terrifying Tuesday morning entirely gone, leaving behind only an unbroken bond of shared survival. I stood at the edge of our stone steps, leaning against the wooden porch post, looking out over the close as the neighborhood children ran through the sprinklers, laughing without a single compliance officer monitoring their joy. Arthur Pendleton walked across the lawn, carrying a basket of fresh vegetables from his garden, a relaxed smile finally breaking through his seasoned detective's features. "We built a real perimeter here, Jack," Arthur said quietly, looking out over the peaceful close. "It took an absolute war to clear out the corruption, but this neighborhood is finally strong enough to protect itself." I nodded, a slow, grim smile forming on my face as I looked down at my family. Margaret Sterling was currently serving a 6-year custodial sentence at HMP Bronzefield for fraud, perjury, and assault by proxy, her empire of leverage completely dismantled. We hadn't just defended our home, we had completely rebuilt the foundation of our community. And as I watched the sun set over the manicured roofs of Orchard Green, I knew with absolute certainty that if any threat ever dared to knock on our close again, they wouldn't find a group of frightened residents. They would find a unit. What an absolutely wild ride. Breaking down the timeline from a simple estate dispute to a full-blown neighborhood war really shows how crazy suburban life can get when egos go unchecked. My biggest takeaway here: documentation is your best weapon. Never underestimate the power of keeping the receipts. I've got a question for you guys. If you were in Jack and Clara's shoes, would you have stayed and fought or just packed up and moved? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one of them. Don't forget to drop a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Catch you guys next time.